The American South in the 1920s was a landscape of suffocating oppression, where the shadow of white supremacy stretched across every county, every town, every dirt road that connected communities struggling to survive under Jim Crow's iron fist. It was an era when racial terror wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized, celebrated, and wielded as a weapon to keep black Americans subjugated. The Ku Klux Klan had experienced a massive resurgence, boasting millions of members. Nationwide, their white hoods and burning crosses, symbols of a hatred that sought to extinguish any flame of black progress or dignity. In this darkness, certain events were orchestrated not merely as acts of violence, but as calculated demonstrations meant to break the spirit of an entire people. Yet history has shown us time and again that the human spirit, particularly when forged in the crucible of injustice, can transform terror into courage, victimhood into resistance, and tragedy into a rallying cry that echoes across generations. This is the story of one such atrocity in rural Mississippi, an event so horrific that those who perpetrated it believed it would cement black subservience for decades to come. Instead, it awakened something they could never have anticipated, a generation of heroes who would refuse to be broken. The town of Coldwater Creek, Mississippi, wasn't marked on most maps in 1923, just another forgotten collection of sharecropper shacks, and a single general store where black families purchased goods on credit they could never fully repay. The population barely reached 300 souls, most of them descendants of enslaved people who had worked the very same land under different terms but similar cruelty. The white landowners, barely 24 families, controlled everything: the land, the credit, the law, and most crucially, the violence that kept the system functioning. Sheriff Coleman Bridger was a third-generation lawman whose grandfather had patrolled these roads as a slave catcher before the Civil War, and he wore that legacy like a badge of honor alongside his actual tin star. The black community of Coldwater Creek had learned to survive through carefully calibrated deference, never meeting white eyes directly, always stepping off sidewalks when white folks approached, teaching their children that survival meant making themselves invisible, small, unthreatening. But even invisibility couldn't always protect them. The trouble began with something as simple as a school, or rather, the dream of one. For 3 years, the black community had been pooling their meager resources, saving nickels and dimes to purchase materials for a proper schoolhouse. The children had been learning in the back of Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Reverend Isaiah Thornton did his best to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic between Sunday services and Wednesday prayer. Meetings, the textbooks were cast-offs from the white school, pages torn and outdated, but they were treasured like gold because they represented something the system was designed to deny: knowledge, and with it, the possibility of change. By the spring of 1923, they had saved nearly $300, an astronomical sum for people who rarely saw cash money, whose labor was compensated through the debt system that kept them perpetually obligated to white landowners. The land they'd secured for the school was a donated acre on the northern edge of the black section of town, far enough from white homes to avoid immediate objection, or so they hoped. But hope was a dangerous commodity in Mississippi in 1923, and word of the school project reached Sheriff Bridger through the network of informants and gossips that kept white power apprised of any black activity that might suggest independence or advancement. On a Tuesday morning in late April, when the spring air should have carried only the scent of magnolia and new cotton plants, Bridger arrived at the construction site with 5 deputies and a dozen Klansmen still wearing the dust of their farms on their boots. The framework of the schoolhouse had just been erected, raw pine timbers standing against the sky like the skeleton of hope itself. Reverend Thornton was there with 15 men from the community, including a young carpenter named Marcus Webb, who had returned from fighting in France. During the Great War with skills and a dangerous belief that his service had earned him a measure of respect. Bridger's first words were simple and devastating. "You boys got a permit for this construction?" Everyone present knew no permit existed that the county would issue to black residents for such a purpose, and everyone knew that was precisely the point. The confrontation that morning could have ended like countless others, with black men forced to dismantle their own dreams, perhaps with a beating or two to emphasize the lesson, and life continuing in its oppressive rhythm. But Marcus Webb made a choice that would alter the course of Coldwater Creek's history. When Sheriff Bridger demanded they tear down the framework immediately, Marcus stepped forward and said quietly but clearly, "We have a right to educate our children. We've broken no law." The words hung in the air like summer lightning before the thunder. The other black men present seemed to stop, breathing, knowing that contradiction of white authority, especially armed white authority, was potentially a death sentence. Bridger's face transformed, reddening from his neck to his receding hairline, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol on his hip. For a moment, the entire scene balanced on a knife's edge, and then Bridger laughed, a sound without humor that his deputies and the Klansmen echoed like a chorus of crows. "You got rights?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got rights? Well, we'll see about that, boy. We'll surely see about that." The white men left without further violence that day, but their departure carried a promise of something worse than immediate brutality. They were planning something, and the entire black community felt the shift in the air like animals sensing an approaching storm. That night, emergency meetings convened in hushed whispers in the church, in homes, in the fields where people could speak without being overheard. Some argued for dismantling the school frame immediately, for Marcus Webb to publicly apologize, for anything that might diffuse the situation. But others, emboldened by Marcus's stand and tired of a lifetime of submission, argued that retreat now would only embolden further attacks, that there would never be a safe time to claim dignity, that if they surrendered this dream, they surrendered everything. Reverend Thornton, a man who had preached cautious accommodation for 20 years, surprised everyone by siding with resistance. "The Lord didn't bring us this far to turn back now," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If we tear down that school ourselves, we're telling our children that their education, their futures, don't matter. I'd rather die standing than live kneeling." The decision was made to continue construction, but with precautions. Men would work in shifts, armed with whatever weapons they could gather, mostly hunting rifles and a few pistols from the war. Lookouts were posted on the roads leading into their section of town. Women and children were told to stay close to home, and contingency plans were made for evacuation if necessary. For 3 days, the work continued under this tense vigilance, the schoolhouse taking shape board by board, a wooden declaration that this community would not be terrorized into abandoning their aspirations. Marcus Webb, who had stood up to German machine guns in the Argonne forest, found himself more frightened here in his hometown than he had been in France, because there at least the enemy wore a different uniform. Here, the men who wanted him dead were his neighbors, people whose crops he had helped harvest, whose children played in the same creek where he had played as a boy. This was terror of a more intimate variety, where hatred wore a familiar face and spoke with an accent identical to his own. The attack came on Saturday night, when the moon was dark and the clouds obscured even the stars. It began with fire, torches thrown onto the roof of the nearly completed schoolhouse, flames catching immediately on the dry pine and leaping into the night sky like demons dancing. The bells of Mount Zion Church began ringing frantically, the agreed-upon alarm signal, and black families poured from their homes into chaos and terror. But this wasn't just arson, it was a coordinated assault. As men rushed to fight the fire, gunshots erupted from the tree line, bullets tearing through the night, striking buildings and flesh indiscriminately. The white mob, estimated later at more than 50 men, many wearing Klan robes, others in civilian clothes, had surrounded the black section of town. Their intention was clear. This wasn't meant to be a warning, but an eradication, a message written in blood and ash that would terrify black communities throughout the region. Women screamed, children cried, and for the first terrible minutes, It seemed as if Coldwater Creek's black community would be massacred entirely. But then something unexpected happened, something the mob had not anticipated in their arrogance and hatred. The black men of Coldwater Creek fought back. Marcus Webb and the other veterans, men who had been trained in warfare, organized a defensive perimeter using the church and several brick buildings as cover. The hunting rifles that had seemed so inadequate proved effective in disciplined hands, and the mob's advance stalled as their easy victims became armed defenders. For nearly 3 hours, a genuine battle raged through the streets of Coldwater Creek, the sound of gunfire echoing for miles across the Delta flatlands. The schoolhouse burned to its foundation, but the community behind it held their ground. By the time the mob withdrew, driven back by fiercer resistance than they had imagined possible, 3 white men lay dead, and at least 7 others were wounded. On the black side, 2 men had been killed: Samuel Porter, a 58-year-old farmer, and Daniel Grant, Marcus Webb's cousin, who was only 19 years old. Another 12 had been wounded, some critically, and the schoolhouse was nothing but smoking embers and ash. The immediate aftermath brought a terrifying silence. Everyone knew that killing white men, even in self-defense, even protecting your own community from an illegal mob attack, was a death sentence in Mississippi. Sheriff Bridger would return with overwhelming force, arrests would be made, and men would hang from trees or burn in cages as entertainment for white crowds who brought their families to watch lynchings like they were attending a county fair. As dawn broke over Coldwater Creek, revealing the destruction and the blood-stained earth, the community faced an impossible choice. Some advocated for immediate flight, for the fighters to escape to the north before the inevitable white retaliation. Others argued that flight was impossible, that the roads would be watched, that attempting to flee would be seen as admission of guilt. But it was Reverend Thornton, his face haggard from a sleepless night of tending to the wounded and comforting the dying, who proposed the most audacious plan. They would not run, they would not hide, and they would demand justice, real justice, by taking their case to the federal government. The idea seemed insane to many, a fantasy born of exhaustion and trauma. Federal intervention in Southern racial matters was virtually non-existent in 1923. This was 7 years before the Scottsboro Boys case would draw national attention, decades before the civil rights movement would force federal action. The federal government had effectively abandoned black Southerners after Reconstruction ended, allowing states to implement Jim Crow laws and turn a blind eye to racial terrorism. But Reverend Thornton had a card to play that others didn't know about. His brother Thomas Thornton had moved to Washington, D.C. in 1919 and worked as a clerk in the Justice Department. It was a menial position, but it meant Thomas had connections, knew how the bureaucracy worked, and might be able to find someone who would listen. More importantly, the NAACP was beginning to establish itself as a force for legal advocacy, and their national office in New York had resources and lawyers who were looking for cases that could challenge the impunity of racial violence. Within hours of sunrise, 2 young men who could pass for field workers were on their way to the nearest town with a telegraph office, carrying a carefully worded message to be sent to Thomas Thornton in Washington. What Reverend Thornton and his community didn't fully understand was that their stand had already begun to reverberate beyond Coldwater Creek. The battle had been heard for miles, and by Sunday morning, rumors were spreading throughout the county and beyond. White communities were shocked that black residents had fought back so effectively, killing white men in the process. The Klan was demanding immediate and severe retaliation, calling for mass arrests and public executions. But there were complications. Some of the dead white men had been identified, and their participation in a night-riding mob attack was harder to deny than usual. Additionally, 2 white farmers who lived on the edge of town, Quakers, who had opposed slavery and maintained quietly cordial relations with their black neighbors, had witnessed the attack and were prepared to testify that the mob had initiated the violence without provocation. Their testimony wouldn't save anyone in a Mississippi court, but it complicated the narrative of black criminality that usually justified racial violence. Sheriff Bridger found himself in the unusual position of having to proceed more carefully than he wanted, aware that this incident had the potential to draw outside attention. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Thomas Thornton received the telegram with a mixture of horror and determination. He immediately took it to his supervisor, who dismissed it as a local matter outside federal jurisdiction. But Thomas didn't stop there. He made copies of the telegram and spent his lunch hour walking to the offices of various newspapers, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic congressmen. Most doors were closed to him, but at the NAACP office he found an audience. Walter White, the organization's assistant secretary, was a man whose light skin allowed him to investigate lynchings and racial violence by passing as white, gathering evidence and testimonies that would be impossible for darker-skinned investigators to obtain. He listened to Thomas's account with intense focus, asking detailed questions, and then made a decision that would prove pivotal. "We're going," he said simply. "We're going to Mississippi, and we're going to document everything. This could be the case that finally forces federal action." Within 48 hours, Walter White was on a train heading south, carrying credentials that identified him as a white newspaper reporter interested in covering the disturbance in Mississippi. Back in Coldwater Creek, the community was fortifying and organizing, knowing that time was against them. The wounded were being cared for in a makeshift hospital in the church, a basement where 3 women with nursing experience worked around the clock with limited supplies. Food was pooled and rationed, as no one could safely go to the general store or into town for provisions. Children were kept indoors, their normal routines of school and play suspended in an atmosphere of siege. The men maintained armed watches in shifts, positioned at strategic points around the community's perimeter. What had begun as a spontaneous defense was evolving into something more organized. A militia of sorts, though no one used that word. Marcus Webb emerged as the tactical leader, his military training providing structure to their preparation. He organized drills, established communication protocols, and most importantly, enforced strict rules of engagement. No one was to fire unless fired upon. No aggressive actions were to be taken. All movements were to be documented and witnessed. He knew their only hope of survival, let alone justice, was to maintain absolute moral clarity about who the aggressors were. On the 5th day after the attack, Sheriff Bridger returned, but not with the overwhelming force everyone expected. Instead, he arrived with only 2 deputies and, surprisingly, a man in a suit who identified himself as Assistant Attorney General Porter from the state capitol. Their visit was brief and formal. Porter interviewed several witnesses, took notes with apparent diligence, and assured everyone that the state was taking the matter seriously. It was all theater, everyone knew, a performance designed to create the appearance of investigation while the real plan developed behind the scenes. But it bought time, and time was what they desperately needed. Each day that passed without mass arrests or lynchings was a small victory, and each day brought Walter White closer to Coldwater Creek. The state's calculated patience was actually a strategic error born of arrogance. They were moving slowly because they assumed they had all the time in the world, that no one outside Mississippi cared what happened to black people in a Delta town, that this would be handled quietly and thoroughly once the initial attention faded. But attention was building rather than fading, in ways the local power structure didn't anticipate. Thomas Thornton's efforts in Washington had borne fruit beyond just the NAACP. A progressive senator from Wisconsin, whose Quaker constituents had connections to the Quaker. Witnesses in Coldwater Creek began asking questions in the Senate. Black newspapers across the country, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, picked up the story and began running headlines about the Battle of Coldwater Creek and the miracle stand against Klan terror. These papers had substantial readerships in black communities throughout the nation. and their coverage turned what might have been an isolated incident into a national cause. Letters and telegrams began flooding into the Justice Department, into the offices of congressmen, into the White House itself, demanding federal investigation and protection for the community. Money started arriving too, small donations from black churches and civil rights groups, funds to help the community survive the siege and to retain lawyers if arrests came. What the Klan and Sheriff Bridger had intended as a demonstration of power was transforming into something they couldn't control, a symbol of resistance that inspired people far beyond Mississippi. Walter White arrived in Coldwater Creek on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, presenting himself to the white authorities as James Sullivan, a reporter for a small Memphis newspaper interested in covering the disturbance from the white perspective. His light skin, blue eyes, and carefully cultivated mannerisms allowed him to pass completely. And for 2 days, he interviewed white residents, Sheriff Bridger, and even some of the Klansmen who had participated in the attack. The conversations were revelatory as the white men spoke freely to someone they believed shared their racial solidarity, describing the attack in detail, boasting about their intentions to teach the niggers a permanent lesson, and expressing frustration that their plan had been foiled by unexpected resistance. White took meticulous notes, documenting names, descriptions of events, and most importantly, admissions of premeditated assault with intent to kill. These men confessed to felonies, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, assault, with the casual confidence of people who knew the legal system would never hold them accountable. White's performance was flawless. He nodded sympathetically, made comments about maintaining racial order, and gave no indication that every word was being recorded as evidence. On his third night, White made his way to the black section of town, finally revealing his true identity and purpose to Reverend Thornton and the community leadership. The relief in that church meeting room was palpable. Someone from the outside had come, someone with resources and connections, someone who believed their lives mattered enough to risk his own by traveling into the heart of Jim Crow territory. White spent hours interviewing witnesses, documenting injuries, photographing the burned remains of the schoolhouse and the bullet holes that scarred the walls of homes and the church. He was particularly interested in the testimony of the two Quaker farmers, Abraham and Rachel Morrison, whose written statements provided crucial corroboration from white witnesses. The Morrisons had already been ostracized by their white neighbors for their willingness to testify truthfully, their farm vandalized, and their family threatened, but they remained steadfast in their commitment to justice. Their courage, White believed, might be the element that made this case different from so many others, where White's solidarity silenced potential dissent. White's most extended interview was with Marcus Webb, whose story embodied the broader tragedy of black veterans returning from World War I. Marcus had been part of the 93rd Division, one of the segregated black units that had served with distinction under French command after American commanders refused to send black soldiers into combat. He had been awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government for bravery in battle, had lived for months in a society that treated him as a man rather than a subspecies, and had returned home expecting that his service had earned him some measure of citizenship. Instead, he came back to a Mississippi that seemed determined to reinforce that military service. Courage or patriotism meant nothing if your skin was dark. In France, Marcus told White, I was a soldier, a man. Here, I'm just another nigger who's supposed to step off the sidewalk and say yes, sir, to any white man who walks by. Well, I'm done stepping aside. I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees. White recognized in Marcus's words something he had heard from black veterans across the South. The new Negro movement was being forged in part by men who had seen another world and refused to accept the old order anymore. Armed with testimony, photographs, and documented confessions from white participants who had unwittingly incriminated themselves, White returned to New York and began orchestrating what would become one of the first major federal civil rights cases, of the 20th century. The NAACP's legal team, led by Moorfield Story, crafted a multi-pronged strategy. First, they filed complaints with the Justice Department under the Enforcement Acts of 1870 to 71, Reconstruction-era laws that made it a federal crime to conspire to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. These laws had been dormant for decades, effectively ignored as the federal government withdrew from protecting black rights, but they remained on the books. Second, they coordinated with friendly congressmen to call for hearings, creating political pressure that couldn't be ignored. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they launched a public relations campaign through black newspapers and progressive white publications, turning Coldwater Creek into a national story that demanded attention. The strategy was ambitious and unprecedented, requiring coordination across legal, political, and public opinion fronts simultaneously. In Mississippi, Sheriff Bridger and the local power structure initially treated these developments with contempt, confident that federal intervention was impossible and that their control was absolute. But as weeks passed and the attention didn't fade, nervous tension began to replace arrogance. The state attorney general, responding to political pressure from Washington, announced that he was opening a formal investigation, not into the white mob's attack, but into the riot and the killing of white men by black residents. Arrest warrants were issued for Marcus Webb and 6 other men identified as leaders of the defense. The charges were murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and inciting a riot. If convicted in a Mississippi court, they faced either execution or life imprisonment at the notorious Parchman Farm, the state penitentiary that was essentially a slavery plantation by another name. The legal noose was tightening, and despite all the national attention and NAACP involvement, the reality remained that these men would be tried in a Mississippi court, before a white judge, by an all-white jury, in a state where black testimony against white defendants was routinely dismissed or punished. But before the arrests could be executed, the Justice Department made a historic decision, responding to intense political pressure, armed with evidence compiled by Walter White, and conscious of the international embarrassment that lynching and racial violence brought to America's image during a period of growing global influence. Attorney General Harry Daugherty announced that the federal government would intervene. U.S. Marshals were dispatched to Coldwater Creek with orders to take custody of the 7 accused men, not to assist in their persecution, but to prevent them from being lynched and to ensure their safety while a federal investigation proceeded. It was an extraordinary action, virtually unprecedented in its assertion of federal authority over what Mississippi insisted was a state matter. The announcement created a constitutional crisis of sorts, with Mississippi's governor declaring that the federal government had no jurisdiction, that states' rights prohibited such interference, and that the accused men were state prisoners who would be tried in state courts. The standoff echoed conflicts from Reconstruction and foreshadowed battles that would define the civil rights era decades later. The arrival of federal marshals in Coldwater Creek on a humid June morning was a moment that no one present would ever forget. 4 marshals, led by a grizzled veteran named Thomas Mackenzie, entered the black section of town in 2 automobiles, federal government seals on the doors, and announced they were there to take the accused men into federal protective custody. The terminology mattered: protective custody rather than arrest, federal jurisdiction rather than criminal charges. For the black community, it was a moment of almost surreal hope, the sight of federal authority being used to protect rather than oppress them, something most had never imagined possible. The marshals were professional, respectful even, addressing the accused men by their proper names and assuring the community that their family members would be kept informed of all proceedings. Marcus Webb and the other 6 men gathered their few possessions, said tearful goodbyes to their families, and were transported not to a Mississippi jail, but to a federal facility in Memphis, Tennessee, 3 hours north. The sight of these black men being escorted out of town by federal marshals, protected by federal authority from state persecution, sent shockwaves through white Mississippi. Sheriff Bridger, standing on the street corner watching the automobiles depart, reportedly said to his deputies, "This is what comes from Washington interference. First it was carpetbaggers and scalawags during Reconstruction. Now this. But they'll go back home eventually, and when they do, we'll remind everyone how things work down here." His statement, overheard and reported, captured the White South's fundamental belief that federal attention was temporary and that local power would ultimately prevail. But what Bridger and others like him didn't understand was that the world had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Great Migration was transferring political power as hundreds of thousands of black Southerners moved to northern and western cities where they could vote. Black newspapers had national reach and influence. International scrutiny, particularly from European nations whose rhetoric about democracy and civilization was complicated by America's racial violence, created diplomatic pressures. The absolute impunity that had characterized racial terror was beginning to crack, not breaking yet, but developing fissures that would widen with time. In Memphis, the 7 men from Coldwater Creek found themselves in a bizarre situation, imprisoned yet protected, charged yet defended, caught in a legal and political battle that transcended their individual fates. NAACP lawyers arrived to represent them, working to prevent their extradition back to Mississippi, while simultaneously building a federal case against the members of the mob who had attacked the community. The legal maneuvering was complex, involving habeas corpus petitions, jurisdictional arguments, and constitutional questions about the scope of federal authority to protect citizens from state-sanctioned violence. For Marcus Webb, sitting in a relatively clean federal cell, reading newspapers that carried stories about his case from across the country, the experience was disorienting. He was still imprisoned, still facing potential death. Yet he was also being called a hero, his name mentioned in the same articles as prominent civil rights leaders, his stand being compared to Spartacus and other historical rebels. Letters arrived from black communities across the nation, offering support, prayers, and small donations for his defense. He had become, without choosing it, a symbol of something larger than himself. The federal investigation proceeded with a thoroughness that would have been unimaginable in a state court. Federal agents interviewed dozens of witnesses, both black and white, documenting the attack with a level of detail that made denial impossible. The Quaker farmers, Abraham and Rachel Morrison, provided testimony that corroborated every major element of the black community's account. Physical evidence, bullet trajectories, burn patterns, the remains of Klan robes found near the scene was collected and analyzed. Most dramatically, the confessions that Walter White had obtained while passing as a white reporter were entered into evidence, presenting the extraordinary situation of white men having proudly admitted to federal investigators what they had boasted about to a man they thought was their ally. The lead federal investigator, a career Justice Department attorney named William Harrison, found himself deeply affected by the case. He had grown up in Kentucky, accepting the racial order as natural, but the evidence he was compiling forced him to confront the reality of systematic racial terrorism and the complete failure of state and local governments to provide equal protection under the law. By August 1923, the federal grand jury handed down indictments against 23 men for conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the Coldwater Creek residents. It was the largest federal prosecution of racial violence since Reconstruction, and the charges were serious. Violations of the Enforcement Acts carried potential sentences of up to 10 years in federal prison. The indictments created pandemonium in Mississippi. Outraged editorials in white newspapers denounced federal tyranny. Politicians gave speeches about states' rights and the sanctity of Southern sovereignty, and the Klan held rallies condemning Northern interference. But something else happened too, something quieter but potentially more significant. Some white Mississippians, a small minority to be sure, began to express discomfort with the violence, not out of any great racial enlightenment, but from pragmatic concerns about federal intervention and economic consequences. If Mississippi became known as a place where the federal government had to intervene to prevent massacres, it might affect business, investment, and the state's already struggling economy. These voices didn't call for racial equality or justice, but they did suggest that perhaps the violence was becoming counterproductive, even from a white supremacist perspective. The federal trial began in November 1923 in a federal courthouse in Oxford, Mississippi, a venue chosen deliberately because federal jurisdiction meant federal juries. And while those juries would still be all white in 1923 Mississippi, they would be drawn from a wider area and theoretically would have to answer to federal law rather than local prejudice. The courtroom was packed every day with a stark division, black spectators on one side, white on the other, and a tense atmosphere that felt perpetually on the edge of violence. The prosecution was led by a team of federal attorneys with support from NAACP lawyers serving as advisors. The defense attorneys were prominent white Mississippi lawyers who framed their case not around denying the attack, but around justifying it, claiming that the black community had been planning an insurrection, that the white men were responding to a threat, that they were protecting their families and their way of life. It was a defense that had worked countless times in state courts when white men were tried for racial violence, a defense rooted in the presumption that black life was worthless and white fear was always justified. The trial stretched across 3 weeks, and the testimony revealed the depths of the racial divide in stark, often heartbreaking detail. Black witnesses described the attack with painful precision, the terror of seeing their homes and church under fire, the chaos of trying to protect children, while bullets tore through walls, the desperate fight for survival against overwhelming numbers. They testified about the years of intimidation and violence that had preceded the attack, the daily humiliations of Jim Crow, the constant fear that shaped every decision. Their testimony was dignified and powerful, but watching the white jurors' faces, many observers doubted it was penetrating the wall of racial prejudice. The white defendants, when they took the stand, showed no remorse. They described the attack as a necessary response to black uppityness, insisted that the school represented a threat to racial order, and claimed that black people needed to be reminded of their place through occasional demonstrations of white power. Their testimony was chilling in its casual acknowledgement of murderous intent, made more so by the evident belief that their honesty would be rewarded rather than punished. The prosecution's most powerful moment came when Marcus Webb took the stand. He wore his army uniform, his medals pinned to his chest, and spoke in a clear, educated voice that challenged every stereotype the defense had invoked. He described his service in France, the battles he had fought, the citation for bravery he had received. He then described coming home to Mississippi, to a place that treated his military service as irrelevant or even threatening, because it had given him a sense of dignity that Jim Crow couldn't tolerate. "I fought for this. In country," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I bled for this country. I watched men die beside me in the mud of France for this country, and I came home to this country believing, foolishly perhaps, that my service meant something, that it had earned me the right to stand up straight, to look a man in the eye, to build a school for children. If that makes me a criminal, if that justifies an armed mob attacking my community, if that makes me deserve to die, then I don't understand what we were fighting for in France. I don't understand what America is supposed to be." His testimony created a profound silence in the courtroom, a moment when the moral stakes of the trial became undeniable. The defense attorney, during cross-examination, tried to break Webb's composure, asking aggressive questions designed to portray him as arrogant, to suggest that military service had made him forget his place, to imply that educated black men were inherently dangerous. But Webb remained calm and articulate, refusing to take the bait, responding to hostility with reason. When asked if he felt any remorse for the white men who had died during the attack, Webb paused for a long moment before answering. "I regret that violence occurred at all," he said carefully. "I regret that we live in a world where defending your home and your children makes you a criminal, where seeking education makes you a target, where standing up straight makes you an enemy. I regret that those men felt such hatred that they were willing to kill strangers in the night. But I don't regret defending my community. I won't apologize for refusing to die without fighting back. If that's what you want from me, you'll be disappointed. The closing arguments were delivered over 2 full days, with both sides understanding that this trial represented something far larger than the fate of 23 defendants. The prosecution argued that the case was fundamentally about whether the United States was a nation of laws that applied equally to all citizens, or whether it was a nation where racial terrorism operated with impunity, where citizenship meant nothing if you were black, where the Constitution was just words on paper that didn't apply south of the Mason-Dixon line. They cited the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction amendments that were supposed to guarantee equal protection, the enforcement acts that Congress had passed specifically to combat racial violence. They argued that the defendants had formed a conspiracy to deny citizens their constitutional rights through violence and intimidation, that their actions were not the impulsive response to a perceived threat, but a calculated attack planned and executed with murderous intent. The evidence, they insisted, was overwhelming and undeniable. Confessions, physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, documentation of conspiracy. Justice, they argued, demanded conviction. The defense, in contrast, made their argument on grounds both legal and cultural. Legally, they claimed that the federal government lacked jurisdiction, that these were state matters involving state crimes that should be adjudicated in state courts under state law. They argued that the enforcement acts were unconstitutional overreach, relics of Reconstruction that violated states' rights and exceeded federal authority. But their more powerful argument, the one that resonated with cultural assumptions shared by the jury, was rooted in white supremacy itself. They portrayed black Mississippians not as citizens with rights, but as a potentially dangerous population that required control and occasional correction. The school, they suggested, wasn't just about education, but about challenging racial hierarchy, about inspiring ideas of equality that would destabilize Southern society. The defense argued that their clients were, in effect, maintaining social order, that what the prosecution called terrorism was actually community self-defense. It was an argument that had justified slavery, black codes, convict leasing, lynching, and every other tool of racial oppression, the argument that white supremacy was natural, necessary, and worth defending through violence. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and those 48 hours felt like an eternity for everyone whose lives hung in the balance. In the federal holding facility in Memphis, Marcus Webb and the other 6 men from Coldwater Creek waited, praying that federal justice might be different from state justice, yet knowing that the jurors were still white Southerners who had grown up under the same racial order that had produced the attack. In Coldwater Creek itself, the community maintained its vigilance, aware that the verdict could trigger either massive retaliation or perhaps the beginning of some accountability. Nationally, black newspapers prepared to cover the verdict as a referendum on whether America would live up to its stated ideals or continue to permit racial terrorism. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict and court would reconvene, the tension was unbearable. The courtroom filled beyond capacity, people standing in aisles and doorways, federal marshals maintaining order as the judge took his seat and the jury filed in. The verdict was mixed and, in its complexity, revealed the fractured state of American justice regarding race. The jury found 11 of the 23 defendants guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights, while acquitting 12 others despite evidence against them being nearly identical. The guilty verdicts were historic, the first time since Reconstruction that a federal jury in the South had convicted white men for racial violence against black citizens. The sentences ranged from 2 to 7 years in federal prison, far less than the maximum allowed, but still real prison time. not the token. Fines or suspended sentences that typically resulted from state prosecutions of racial violence. For the NAACP and civil rights advocates, it was a partial victory, proof that federal prosecution of racial terrorism was possible, that some accountability could be achieved. For the black community of Coldwater Creek, watching from segregated seats in the courtroom gallery, the emotions were complicated. Relief that anyone was being held accountable, frustration that more than half had been acquitted, fear about what the verdict might trigger in terms of white retaliation. The acquittals revealed the limitations of federal intervention. The jurors, interviewed later by newspapers, acknowledged that the evidence had been clear for all defendants, but they had voted to acquit some because they didn't want to send too many white men to prison over a Negro matter, as one juror put it, with shocking honesty. Even in federal court, even with overwhelming evidence, racial prejudice shaped outcomes. The judge, in sentencing the convicted defendants, made statements that suggested his own discomfort with imposing real penalties, noting that the defendants were respected members of their communities who had acted from misguided but sincere beliefs about maintaining social order. The language was patronizing, minimizing attempted mass murder as a social policy disagreement, yet the fact remained that these men would serve time in federal prison. It was an imperfect, incomplete justice, but it was more justice than had been achieved in thousands of similar cases throughout the South, where perpetrators faced no consequences whatsoever. For Marcus Webb and the other 6 men who had been in federal custody, the verdict brought a different kind of resolution. The state murder charges against them were quietly dropped, Mississippi authorities recognizing that prosecuting black men for defending their community would look particularly untenable given the federal convictions against their attackers. They were released from custody in January 1924, nearly 9 months after the attack, and returned to Coldwater Creek as heroes and symbols. But heroism came with costs. Marcus found his home vandalized, his few possessions destroyed, threatening notes left warning him to leave Mississippi or face consequences. Several employers in the region put out word that any black worker associated with the defense of Coldwater Creek would not be hired, an economic warfare designed to force them out through starvation. The message from white Mississippi was clear. The federal government might have won a battle in court, but the war for white supremacy would continue through economic pressure, social ostracism, and the ever-present threat of violence that required no court conviction to execute. In the months following the trial, the community of Coldwater Creek faced a crucial decision about their future. The burned schoolhouse site remained empty, a reminder of both destruction and resistance. Some argued for leaving it that way, a memorial to what they had endured. Others advocated for rebuilding, for refusing to let terrorism permanently deny their children education. The debate was passionate and painful, dividing families and friends who had stood together during the attack but now disagreed about how to move forward. Reverend Thornton, his health failing from the stress of the previous year, called a community meeting in Mount Zion Baptist Church to address the question. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls. The discussion lasted for hours, with voices raised in anger and fear and hope and exhaustion. Finally, it was Marcus Webb who stood and proposed a resolution. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We rebuild because that's what they tried to stop. We rebuild because our children deserve education. We rebuild because if we don't, they win. They didn't kill us that night, and they won't stop us from claiming what should have always been ours, the right to educate our children, to improve our lives, to stand as human beings with dignity." The decision to rebuild was made, but it required more than determination. It required resources that the community didn't have. The original schoolhouse fund had been depleted by legal fees and supporting families during the months of siege. But word of their decision spread through the network of black newspapers and churches that had followed their story, and donations began arriving from across the country. Black churches held fundraisers, civil rights organizations sent money, individual families sent dollar bills, wrapped in letters of support and admiration. The NAACP designated Coldwater Creek's school reconstruction as a national project, a symbol of resilience that would inspire other communities facing similar terrorism. By the spring of 1924, construction began again on the schoolhouse, this time with better materials and a brick exterior that would be harder to burn. The work proceeded under the same armed guard as before, but now with less fear, because the federal trial had demonstrated that violence might have consequences, that impunity wasn't absolute anymore. The school opened in September 1924, exactly 17 months after the attack that had tried to prevent its existence. The building was modest but solid, with 2 classrooms, a small library room, and for the first time, indoor plumbing, a luxury that even the white school in town didn't have. The opening ceremony was attended by over 300 people, including several reporters from black newspapers, representatives from the NAACP, and even Walter White himself, who had risked his life investigating the attack. Reverend Thornton, visibly frail but spiritually fierce, gave the dedication speech. "This building," he said, "stands as testimony that terrorism cannot destroy determination, that violence cannot kill dreams, that hatred cannot extinguish hope. Every child who learns to read in these rooms, every young person who discovers they are capable of greatness within these walls, every graduate who goes on to build better lives, they are our victory, our answer to those who tried to break us." They wanted to instill fear. Instead, they forged heroes, heroes who will teach our children that dignity is worth fighting for, that justice is possible, and that we will never, ever give up. The story of Coldwater Creek reverberated through the decades that followed, becoming part of the narrative of black resistance that would eventually fuel the civil rights movement. The community itself experienced mixed fortunes. Some families, exhausted by the constant tension and economic pressure, eventually left Mississippi for Chicago, Detroit, or California, joining the Great Migration. Others stayed, determined to maintain the foothold they had fought for, to prove that black people could not be driven out by terrorism. The school operated continuously, even as Mississippi's state government actively worked to underfund and undermine black education throughout the Jim Crow era. Students who attended Coldwater Creek School carried with them not just academic knowledge, but a profound understanding that their education had been literally fought for, that people had been willing to die to ensure they had opportunities that racial oppression tried to deny. Several graduates went on to become teachers themselves, spreading throughout the South and bringing with them the lessons of resistance and resilience they had learned. Marcus Webb lived until 1973, dying at age 74, having witnessed the entire arc of the civil rights movement from his front porch. He never left Coldwater Creek, despite multiple opportunities and considerable pressure to do so. He became a teacher at the school he had helped defend, educating 3 generations of black children not just in reading and mathematics, but in civic courage and self-respect. During the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement accelerated, young activists came to Coldwater Creek to hear his stories, to learn from someone who had stood against racial terrorism decades before the movement made such resistance nationally visible. He marched in the March on Washington in 1963, wearing his world, wore our uniform and medals, carrying a sign that read, "Still Fighting for Freedom, 1918 and 1963. Reporters who interviewed him noted that he spoke without bitterness, despite everything he had endured, maintaining a quiet dignity and an unshakable belief that justice, though delayed, was inevitable. His funeral in 1973 was attended by over 1,000 people, including veterans of both World Wars and Vietnam, civil rights leaders, and former students who credited him with changing their lives. The legal precedent established by the Coldwater Creek case proved significant, though its impact was limited by the broader failure of political will to enforce civil rights in the South. The successful federal prosecution demonstrated that such action was possible, providing a template that would be used sporadically over subsequent decades when particularly egregious racial violence drew national attention. However, it also demonstrated the limitations, partial convictions, relatively light sentences, and the inability of federal courts alone to transform the entire racial order of Southern society. Real change would require not just occasional legal victories, but sustained political pressure, mass movements, federal legislation with enforcement mechanisms, and a fundamental transformation of American racial consciousness. The courage shown by the Coldwater Creek community contributed to that long struggle, providing one more example that resistance was possible, that Black Americans would not passively accept terrorism, that even against overwhelming power, dignity, and determination could achieve something approaching justice. Today, the community of Coldwater Creek exists in transformed form, its population dispersed. Many of the families who fought that night in 1923 now scattered across the nation. The schoolhouse still stands, converted into a community center and small museum that documents the attack, the trial, and the resistance that defined that crucial year. Visitors can see photographs of Marcus Webb in his uniform, letters from supporters across the country, newspaper clippings from Black newspapers that covered the story, and most movingly, a roster of the students who attended the school over its decades of operation, many of whom went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, activists, and community leaders. The museum is maintained by descendants of the original families and by historians who recognize Coldwater Creek as an important chapter in the long history of Black resistance to racial terrorism. Educational groups visit, particularly schools studying civil rights history, and the story is increasingly included in academic studies of the period between Reconstruction and the civil rights movement. That long era when Black Americans maintained resistance even as national attention waned and federal support disappeared. The burned foundation of the original schoolhouse, which stood just meters from where the brick building was constructed, has been preserved as a memorial. Bronze plaques identify the two men who died defending the community that night, Samuel Porter and Daniel Grant, along with all the others who were wounded. Each year on the anniversary of the attack, descendants gather for a remembrance ceremony, often bringing children and grandchildren to ensure that the story is passed down, that the sacrifice is not forgotten. The ceremony always includes readings from the trial transcripts, particularly Marcus Webb's testimony, and always ends with children from the community reciting the names of those who fought, a litany that transforms individual names into collective memory. They wanted to instill fear, the ceremony leader says each year, echoing Reverend Thornton's dedication speech. It forged heroes instead, the community responds in unison. The call and response captures the essential truth that the 8 perpetrators of the attack could not understand, that oppression, when met with courage, does not break the spirit, but tempers it, creating strength that endures across generations. The broader significance of Coldwater Creek lies in what it represents about the long, often overlooked history of Black armed self-defense and resistance to racial terrorism. For too long, historical narratives portrayed Black Americans during the Jim Crow era as purely passive victims waiting for white allies or federal intervention to address their oppression. Stories like Coldwater Creek complicate and enrich that understanding, revealing that Black communities actively resisted, that they organized for self-defense, that they fought back when attacked, and that they pursued justice through every available channel, even when the odds were overwhelmingly against success. The community's resistance wasn't suicidal bravado, but calculated courage, organized and disciplined, seeking not revenge, but protection and accountability. Their story inspired contemporaries and provides inspiration still, a reminder that ordinary people facing extraordinary oppression can become heroes not by seeking that role, but by refusing to accept injustice, by standing up when it would be easier to kneel, by fighting back when fighting back seems impossible. The racist atrocity that was meant to instill permanent fear instead forged heroes whose courage echoes across a century, reminding us that dignity once claimed cannot be taken back, and that justice, though long delayed, becomes more possible with each act of courageous resistance.